The music, the costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
At 78 years old, Benny Andersson shocked fans with a confession no one expected. For decades, ABBA's story has been told as glitter, success, and timeless pop hits. But the real story behind Benny's words is far more complicated. Hidden romances, fractured friendships, and choices that nearly tore the group apart forever have been buried beneath the music. Now, Benny's candid reflection has peeled back the curtain on a past fans thought they already knew. And it changes everything about how we see ABBA's journey, early life, and musical roots. Benny Andersson's story began in Stockholm in 1946, inside a working-class home where music wasn't just background noise. It was part of daily life. His father and grandfather both played the accordion, and young Benny would sit wide-eyed, watching the keys move under their hands. Before long, he was playing too, discovering a talent that felt less like practice and more like instinct. By the time most kids his age were worrying about homework, Benny was consumed by sound. Elvis Presley had exploded onto the scene, and like so many teenagers of the 1950s, Benny was electrified by rock and roll. But what made him different was the way he mixed those raw American influences with Sweden's own folk traditions and the slick, sentimental style of Schlager music. Even then, he wasn't copying, he was blending, creating something uniquely his own. School quickly fell to the side. At 15, Benny walked away from the classroom for good and poured everything into his first true love, music. Within a few short years, that decision would pay off when he joined the Hep Stars, a Swedish rock band so popular they were nicknamed the Swedish Beatles. Screaming fans, sold-out shows, and constant touring turned Benny into a teenage idol. But it wasn't just about fame. Behind the scenes, he was quietly honing his songwriting, experimenting with melodies that would one day echo across the world. What no one knew then was that these early choices and the music he was writing in cramped tour buses and smoky clubs were laying the foundation for something much bigger than anyone could imagine. Meeting Bjorn, Agnetha, and Annie Frid. The turning point in Benny's life came in 1966, when fate introduced him to another rising star, Bjorn Ulvaeus. Bjorn was leading a popular folk group at the time, and when the two met at a party, it was as if their musical instincts clicked instantly. They stayed up all night trading ideas, sketching melodies, and discovering that together, they could create something neither could achieve alone. A creative partnership was born, one that would shape the future of pop music. But their story didn't end there. Just a few years later, two more voices would enter the picture, voices that changed everything. Benny met Annie Frid Lingstad, a singer with a deep, smoky tone, while Bjorn crossed paths with Agnetha Faltskog, whose crystal-clear voice could cut straight through a room. The chemistry was undeniable, both musically and personally. Before long, Benny was romantically linked with Annie Frid, while Bjorn and Agnetha fell in love. On paper, it might have looked like a fairy tale. Two young men, two talented women, love stories blossoming alongside musical collaboration. But what truly set them apart was the sound they created when the four came together. Their voices wove into harmonies so precise, so unexpected, that even the earliest recordings hinted at magic. Friends and producers who heard them perform privately described it as lightning in a bottle, something you couldn't manufacture, only stumble upon once in a lifetime. Still, at that time, none of them could have predicted what was coming. They were just four ambitious young artists in Sweden, enjoying the thrill of making music with the people they loved. The world had yet to discover their names, but that moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. The rise of ABBA, Ring Ring Waterloo. By the early 1970s, the four had officially joined forces, but success didn't come overnight. Their first big test was the Swedish selection for Eurovision in 1973, where they entered with a bright, catchy track called Ring Ring. The song had all the hallmarks of their sound, soaring harmonies, playful lyrics, and that polished production Benny and Bjorn were becoming known for. In Sweden, it was a smash, climbing the charts and turning the group into rising stars at home. But in Eurovision, it didn't even make the cut. For many artists, that kind of rejection would have been a crushing blow. But for Benny, Bjorn, Agnetha, and Annie Frid, it became fuel. They went back to the drawing board, determined to return stronger. And just 1 year later, they did. In 1974, they unveiled Waterloo, a song that would change everything. With pounding piano chords, playful lyrics, and an energy that felt fresh compared to Eurovision's usual ballads, it was the perfect vehicle for the group's charm. Agnetha and Annie Frid dazzled in colorful outfits, their voices blending seamlessly, while Benny and Bjorn's musicianship drove the performance forward. When they stepped on stage in Brighton, England, they weren't just competing, they were announcing themselves to the world, and the world responded. Waterloo didn't just win Eurovision. It exploded across Europe and climbed the charts in the United States, making ABBA one of the first acts from continental Europe to truly break into the English-speaking pop world. Practically overnight, their name was everywhere, and the global phenomenon we now know as ABBA had officially begun. But as their fame grew, so did the pressures, and the personal dynamics within the band would soon be tested in ways none of them could have predicted. Peak fame, personal costs. With Waterloo behind them, ABBA skyrocketed into a level of fame few could imagine. The mid-1970s saw a relentless wave of hits: Mamma Mia, SOS, Fernando, and, of course, Dancing Queen, which became an anthem across the world. Their songs weren't just catchy pop tunes. They were carefully crafted, blending Benny and Bjorn's meticulous songwriting with Agnetha and Annie Frid's voices that carried both power and vulnerability. Stadiums filled, records shattered, and ABBA became one of the most recognizable names in music history. But behind the glittering costumes and the polished performances, the personal costs were mounting. Constant touring and the crushing demands of fame placed enormous strain on the group, especially the couples at the center of it all. Benny and Annie Frid's relationship, once a whirlwind romance, began to show cracks under the weight of the spotlight. And Bjorn and Agnetha, who were raising 2 young children while balancing global superstardom, found themselves caught between the demands of family and the demands of a career that never slowed down. By the late 1970s, tensions were impossible to ignore. Rumors swirled about disagreements backstage, about long silences and unspoken resentments. Fans saw only the perfection on stage, but those closest to the group noticed the subtle signs. The way they drifted apart in interviews, the emotional weight hidden in their newer songs. Tracks like Knowing Me, Knowing You, and The Winner Takes It All weren't just hits. They felt like confessions set to music. For ABBA, the very thing that had united them, the blend of love, music, and partnership, was starting to unravel. And as the 1980s approached, the cracks in their personal lives would collide head-on with the pressures of their career, pushing the group toward a decision no fan wanted to see coming. Breakups and the end of ABBA. By the dawn of the 1980s, the fractures that had been building inside ABBA could no longer be hidden. First came the news that shocked fans everywhere. Bjorn and Agnetha were divorcing. For years, their marriage had been seen as part of the band's magic, the fairy tale woven into the music. But behind the scenes, their relationship had become strained under the pressures of fame, constant travel, and the very different paths their lives seemed to be taking. Then, not long after, Benny and Annie Frid followed with their own split. What had once been 2 love stories that gave ABBA its heart had now collapsed in a heartbreak. And though the 4 tried to carry on professionally, the emotional toll was written into the music itself. Songs like The Winner Takes It All weren't just commercial successes. They felt like raw reflections of everything they were living through in real time. Despite the pain, ABBA didn't simply fade away. They pushed forward, releasing albums like Super Trooper and The Visitors, which carried some of their most mature and introspective work. But even as the music grew darker and more complex, the unity that had carried them through their rise was gone. Every photo shoot, every interview, every recording session carried an unspoken truth. ABBA was coming to an end. By 1982, the group quietly stepped away. There was no official farewell tour, no grand announcement. One of the most successful pop groups in history simply stopped. To the outside world, it seemed like the end of an era. But for Benny and the others, it was a necessary retreat from a storm of personal pain, creative exhaustion, and the weight of expectations that had become too heavy to carry. Still, even as the final curtain fell on ABBA's first chapter, their music refused to fade. Fans clung to the songs, and over time, nostalgia would turn into something far greater, a legacy that refused to die. Life after ABBA, triumph and tragedy. When ABBA quietly stepped away in the early 1980s, many assumed Benny Andersson would fade with the group. But Benny was never just a pop star. He was a composer at heart, and the end of ABBA only opened new doors for him. Teaming up with Bjorn once again, he began writing for the stage, experimenting with storytelling on a scale bigger than anything they had done before. The pair's first major venture, the musical Chess, debuted in 1984. Though the production had a mixed run in theaters, its soundtrack exploded. Songs like One Night in Bangkok and I Know Him So Well became international hits, proving that Benny's gift for melody hadn't gone anywhere. Beyond the spotlight, Benny also threw himself into new projects closer to his roots. He formed the Benny Andersson's Orchestra, blending folk, pop, and traditional Swedish dance music into something deeply personal. For him, it wasn't about chasing stadium crowds anymore. It was about creating the kind of music that spoke to his soul and reconnecting with the traditions that first inspired him as a child. But while triumphs kept coming professionally, Benny's personal life carried heavier burdens. Fame had taken its toll, and whispers about his struggles with alcohol followed him for years. It was a battle he rarely spoke about, but those close to him knew it shaped many of his choices during the post-ABBA years. Despite these struggles, he built a stable family life with his wife Mona Norklid, also a musician, and together they raised their son, Ludwig, who would eventually follow in his father's footsteps in music. Through it all, Benny's career became a story of balance, between reinvention and tradition, between success and private struggles. And while it seemed for a time that ABBA was nothing more than a memory, fate had one more twist in store. Because decades later, a revival unlike anything in pop history was about to thrust Benny and ABBA back into the global spotlight. The long road to reunion. For years after ABBA's quiet split, the idea of a reunion seemed impossible. Fans begged, the press speculated, but the four members rarely even appeared together in public. Benny in particular insisted that the past was the past. He often said that ABBA had ended on its own terms, and there was no need to try to recreate the magic. Yet, the music never stopped living. In the early 1990s, the release of ABBA Gold sparked a massive resurgence. Suddenly, a whole new generation was discovering songs like Dancing Queen and Take a Chance on Me. Benny watched as tracks written in the 1970s were topping charts again 20 years later. Still, even as the nostalgia wave grew, he resisted the idea of a comeback. "You can't repeat the past," he once said, and trying to would only ruin it. Then came Mamma Mia, first a musical, then a global movie phenomenon. By the 2000s, ABBA wasn't just a memory, it was bigger than ever. Fans speculated constantly. Would the four of them ever sing together again? Rumors flew after secret meetings were reported, after sightings of Benny with Bjorn, Agnetha, and Anni-Frid together in Stockholm. Each time, the world held its breath, only to be disappointed when nothing happened. Decades passed this way. ABBA's legend only grew stronger, while Benny stayed focused on his orchestra and composing. But the pull of unfinished business lingered. Quietly, away from cameras, the four members began meeting again. They weren't rehearsing for a tour, at least not at first. They were reconnecting as people, as friends who had once been family. And then, in the late 2010s, the impossible became real. ABBA confirmed what no one thought they'd ever hear. They were recording new music together for the first time in nearly 40 years. The announcement sent shockwaves across the world. Fans who had waited decades couldn't believe it. Benny Andersson, the man who had resisted nostalgia for so long, was now at the heart of ABBA's miraculous reunion. But the story didn't end there. What they unveiled next would be one of the most ambitious comebacks in music history. Benny's confession at 78. At 78, Benny Andersson stepped back into the spotlight not just as a musician, but as a man willing to reflect on a life filled with triumph, heartbreak, and music that changed the world. In a rare and deeply personal moment at ABBA's Voyage show, Benny opened up about the decades behind the glitter, the stage, and the songs. Standing alongside his former wife and bandmate, Anni-Frid Freda Lingstad, Benny spoke with a warmth and honesty that few had ever witnessed. He recalled the early days with Bjorn, Agnetha, and Freda, not just the creative sparks, but the emotional bonds that carried them through success and struggle alike. For Benny, those memories were a reminder that ABBA had always been about more than fame. It was about friendship, love, and the courage to face life's unexpected turns together. When asked about the breakups, the personal losses, and the years apart, Benny didn't shy away. He admitted that stepping away from the group and navigating his own relationships had been painful, yet necessary. "We loved each other," he said, smiling at Freda. "And even when life pulled us in different directions, that bond never really broke." The audience erupted, sensing the quiet power of decades-old affection that had survived fame, divorce, and distance. Benny also reflected on the reunion itself. He spoke about returning to the studio after so many years, about the surreal feeling of recording Voyage with the same voices he had worked with as a young man. There was nostalgia, yes, but also a recognition that this was something entirely new. The holographic concerts, the digital avatars, the high-tech production, it was ABBA, but reimagined for a generation that had never seen the original four together live. Perhaps the most touching moment came when Benny addressed Freda directly. With humor and tenderness, he recalled stories from their early days, the laughter, the late nights writing songs, the shared victories and heartbreaks. In that moment, the audience realized that beyond the sequins and charts, ABBA had always been a story of human connection. Benny's confession wasn't about secrets or scandals. It was about truth, reflection, and the enduring power of love, music, and friendship. And as the cheers filled the arena, it was clear that ABBA's story, decades in the making, wasn't just a memory. It was alive, evolving, and still capable of touching hearts around the world. Benny's words at 78 reminded everyone that sometimes the most extraordinary confessions aren't the shocking ones. They're the ones that show the humanity behind the legend. Thought-provoking close. ABBA's story is more than just catchy songs and glittering costumes. It's a tale of talent, heartbreak, resilience, and the passage of time. From Benny's childhood accordion to the record-breaking success of Dancing Queen, the highs were breathtaking. But the personal costs, the divorces, the tragedies, the years apart, remind us that even legends are human. As we watch ABBA Voyage and hear their timeless music, we're not just enjoying nostalgia. We're witnessing the endurance of friendship, creativity, and the courage to reconnect with the past while embracing the future. Benny's reflections at 78, standing alongside Freda, show that even after decades of separation, respect, affection, and shared history can survive and even thrive. It also raises a question that lingers long after the music fades. Was ABBA's breakup inevitable, or did their personal lives simply reflect the pressures of fame? And as they step into a modern stage with holograms and new productions, we're reminded that legacies are never static. They evolve, inspire, and continue to shape generations. ABBA's journey teaches us that behind every hit song lies a story of human complexity, love, loss, resilience, and ultimately, triumph. And maybe that's why, even decades later, their music still makes us dance, laugh, and feel deeply. So, the next time you hum Mamma Mia or Sway to Waterloo, remember, you're not just listening to a band, you're witnessing a story of life itself, one note at a time.